Hey guys, welcome back to the Blue Playthrough. Today I'm going to continue on the civil rights, and if you hear me cough or anything, I have a really bad chest cold and it's really kicking my butt right now, but still, I want to make this video. So, last time I talked a little bit about how medicine was used against those who were too poor to afford it, and how a lot of times medicine can be used to keep down people. So I want to talk today about MCHR, which is the Medical Community for Human Rights. Now, why would medicine be used to create an unequal setting between people? Well, why not? What's the most important thing is to stay healthy. And if you're able to control a population because they can't afford the medicine, then you are going to be able to oppress them. And that's exactly what they were doing in the South. Now, MCHR was formed June of 1964 to provide medical care to those who had gone down to Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, to help with voter registrations, to help the civil rights workers and the marchers. Because once these people were arrested, a lot of times they were harshly abused by the police. There's stories out of MCHR where they talk about women who were pregnant being arrested and beaten up in jail. There were women who got raped in jail because of the cops. And so MCHR comes into play. They're going to try and help with the medical. They're going to try and create a new form of medicine. Well, during this time, you have the AMA, the American Medical Association, who actually refused to do anything about Southern segregation of doctors. It used to be, if you were a doctor and you wanted privileges in the hospital, you didn't just have to have the AMA's approval of being a doctor. You actually had to get the approval of the hospital itself. Well, in the South, they're not going to give many people who are African Americans the ability to practice in the hospital because they're African American. They don't want them in their hospitals because all they want is white doctors, white hospitals, white people. So, Pikachu. I'll try and catch this. So, they start protesting the AMA about this. They start to come up and they try to say that they need to change their practices because during this time you have federal funding going to these hospitals who refuse to have a black doctor on staff, who treat African Americans like trash. A lot of times the hospital wings for African Americans, especially in the Deep South, were actually unair conditioned. They didn't have, I don't have any Pokeballs. They didn't have air conditioning. They didn't have anything like that. So they were left on these wards, open wards, where everybody had to kind of fend from themselves. And a lot of African Americans ended up dying of this. You have, during this time period, you also had the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, where they had a bunch of African American men sign up for this, saying that they were testing out medicine for syphilis, and they actually didn't even treat them. They didn't even give them the antibiotics, even though we had the cure for syphilis. So, the MCHR was founded by Walter Lear on he was born May 4th, 1923, and died May 29th, 2010. Well, in 1910. Sorry, I'm writing a paper. And MCHR was actually made up of doctors, psychologists, nurses, all the people who could help during the civil rights movement. A lot of times these people would come down during the summer and they'd volunteer like for 3 or 4 months and then they'd go back to their normal homes. Well, they did this because they wanted to help the people who couldn't help themselves, because in these African American communities, the doctor's offices, they had segregated white waiting rooms, which were air conditioning, and black waiting rooms, which of course, once again, were unair conditioned. So, if you want to read more about MCHR, there's a really good book called The Good Doctor, The Medical Committee for Human Rights, and the Struggle for Social Justice in Healthcare by John Dittner. it's an amazing book because this is actually a really forgotten topic of the civil rights movement. But MCHR marched in the Selma March with the marchers to make sure that they got proper health care so they weren't attacked or anything like that. And they also were famous for trying and helping out any way they could. They would even help injured officers, but a lot of times they were chased off. In Mississippi, the Surgeon General of Mississippi even threatened a lot of their licenses because he said it was inappropriate for them to try and help the African American community. And a lot of these doctors and nurses did risk their license to try and help. The Medical Committee for Human Rights is very interesting because they ended up doing more good than any other medical group that came down during the South. You can still look them up and you'll find their pamphlets where they talk about stuffy nose. Where they talk about like what they stand for, who's in it, who's a part of it, how you can help. And it's really interesting just to read. Now, switching gears from medicine to school. Of course, we have our first case, Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, in 1954, where it forces the integration of schools. Now, that's not the case I want to talk about today. The case I want to talk about today is actually the case of Ruby Bridges. She's actually an African-American girl born in Mississippi, moved to Louisiana, but she is the first African-American allowed into an all-white elementary school called, did I not write down the name? Well, it was in New Orleans. Now, Bridges' case is pretty cool because she actually still lives and she talks about her case. She tours the country talking about it. Now, Ruby was one of 9 children ordered by Judge J.S. Kelly Wright on November 14th, 1960, to be allowed into the school. Well, once the parents found out she was going to be allowed into the school, there was massive riots. The parents actually pulled their children out of the school because they didn't want their children going to school with an African-American child because they considered her dirty. And when she actually arrives at the school, she describes it, she says, I thought it was Mardi Gras because there were so many people, but then I noticed the signs, and they were all signs about hating me and why I should be allowed to go to school. And she said, I had to keep my mouth shut. I couldn't whimper, I couldn't cry, I couldn't show them any weakness, even though I wanted to. And she even talks about one of the teachers coming in after her first day, where she ended up going to the bathroom and sitting in the bathroom crying, and one of the white teachers comes in and asks her, Ruby, what's wrong? And Ruby says, I just can't take this because everybody hates me, and why do they hate me? And the teacher said, don't let them get to you. You can only do what's right for you. And after that, after a few weeks, the parents started sending their kids back to school, but this really stood out to Ruby, and there's actually a book called The Story of Ruby Bridges. If you want to check it out, it's a scholastic book made mostly for young kids, but still. Now, Ruby's story is very unique because of where it took place, New Orleans. And back then, New Orleans was very much a divided city. There was a white side and the black side. And Ruby did her best, and she actually still lives in New Orleans with her children. And there's actually a very famous painting of Ruby walking into that school with her head held high. Now, when we think of the civil rights movement, we kind of forget about both the scholastic side of it and the medical side of it because a lot of people don't talk about that. I mean, you have integrations of schools such as Ole Miss, FSU, UF, that were major fights. I mean, FSU, I wrote a paper on this in one of the articles I used, G.I. Joe versus Jim Crow, racial violence in Florida. There's 2 main schools up in Tallahassee. There's FSU and I forget the other school. It's the Rattlesnakes. FAMU. And back then, the African American soldiers who wanted to go to the FSU game, they got priority seating, but they were still attacked. Like at the homecoming game of one of the FSU games, they were violently attacked by the white students from FAMU, and it was a horrible attack, yet the police of Tallahassee stood by and did nothing. And there are very few towns in Florida that were accepting of African Americans during this time, one of them actually being my hometown of Panama City Beach, where they actually threw it wasn't a pro-African American parade, but it was an event where African Americans and whites, like servicemen who were African American, could come in and mix and mingle with the white people of the town, and it went really great, and it was one of the few high points in reading through the racial violence, but it wasn't very easy, and African Americans weren't trusted with guns, so when Pearl Harbor was attacked, a lot of the African Americans who were on bases like MacDill had no idea what was going on. All they saw was a bunch of white men running around with guns, and they were kind of terrified for their lives. They were afraid that at any moment in time, they were going to get shot and killed, because this is Florida. This is where the KKK is. This is where a lot of bad things happen to African Americans, and it was pretty incredible to read. And I mean, some of the accounts are heartbreaking because you want to reach back in time and slap people, but it was still really good to learn about. Now, I think next week I will talk about World War II, starting with what are the causes, so I'd have to trace it back to World War I, and probably fight Brock, maybe. So, bye guys.